Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Have you ever felt like your life was stuck, like nothing ever changed? Like every day was just the same, a routine, and nothing more? Well, that was the life of Mark Davis, a 23-year-old student living in a small Texas town, struggling to keep his head above water. His father had passed away, leaving behind mountains of debt. Mark was doing his best to balance law school, a part-time job, and the constant pressure of his family's financial troubles. But everything seemed to be slipping out of his grasp. It was on a rainy afternoon, as Mark trudged down the street with his backpack slung over his shoulder, that he got a call. The voice on the other end was cool and direct. "Mark Davis," the woman said, "I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." He frowned. "Who are you?" he asked, confused. "I know enough," she replied smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. Mark arrived at the bistro, the rain soaking his jacket. He stepped inside. The warm air and the scent of fresh coffee greeted him. At a corner table sat Eleanor Brooks. She was a striking woman in her early 70s, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. Mark hesitated before sitting across from her. She didn't waste any time. "I know about your debts," she began, her voice calm. "And I know you're struggling to make ends meet. I'm here to offer a solution. Marry me." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked in disbelief, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice shaky. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her piercing blue eyes locking with his. "This isn't about romance," she continued. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll be my husband. Think of it as a contract. You'll get a steady income, a home, and all your problems will be solved." Mark stared at her, his mind racing. How could he refuse? His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his younger sister's tuition was just as overwhelming. He was desperate, and here was an offer that could change everything. Mark shook his head, trying to process the offer. "Why me?" he asked, his voice strained. Eleanor didn't flinch. "You're young, unattached, and you need money. You're desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Mark. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my estate. Nothing more. It's a simple deal." Mark stared at her, torn between his pride and his desperation. He sat back, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. It was insane. Marrying a woman he didn't even know, just to get out of debt. It felt wrong, but what choice did he have? He thought of his mother, his sister, and the crushing weight of their future. He had to protect them. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." Eleanor smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." And just like that, Mark found himself agreeing to a marriage he never wanted. But little did he know, this decision would change not only his life, but Eleanor's as well. Mark's decision to marry Eleanor wasn't one he made lightly. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in his head. He hadn't wanted to accept her offer, but with his family struggling and the weight of their debts pressing down on him, he felt like he had no other choice. What other option did he have? His mother's health was deteriorating, his sister's tuition fees were due, and the future seemed more uncertain by the day. Eleanor's offer was a lifeline, even if it meant giving up his pride. The next day, Mark met Eleanor again at the bistro to finalize the details. Eleanor was waiting for him, her posture regal, exuding calm authority. She handed him a legal contract, outlining the terms of their arrangement. There would be no love involved, only companionship, a formal partnership that would allow her to secure her legacy and allow him to solve his financial problems. Mark couldn't deny that the offer seemed straightforward. It wasn't romantic, but it was practical. He had to admit to himself that he could live with it. It was the only way to give his family a better future. Mark signed the contract, sealing his fate in a way he never could have imagined. Eleanor's eyes briefly softened when she saw him hesitate, but she quickly masked it with a faint smile. "We'll move forward with the formalities," she said. "But remember, This is a business arrangement. There will be no feelings involved. Just companionship. Mark nodded, his stomach in knots. He still couldn't believe he was doing this, but he told himself it was for the right reasons. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings, and uncomfortable silences. Eleanor arranged for a small ceremony, a simple courthouse wedding. There were no guests, no grand decorations, just the two of them, exchanging vows in front of a notary and her lawyer. Mark felt the weight of it all as he stood at the altar, trying to ignore the strange sense of finality in the air. The words felt empty, and yet they were necessary. When the ceremony ended, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." Her tone was steady, but there was a flicker of something deeper, perhaps satisfaction or relief. Mark felt a twinge of guilt. Was he making a mistake? Should he have tried harder to find another way? But there was no time for second-guessing. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. That evening, they arrived at Eleanor's estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its grand columns and stone facade imposing against the night sky. Mark stepped out of the cab, feeling small in comparison to the opulence surrounding him. It was like stepping into a different world. Eleanor led him inside, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The house was cold and silent, the kind of place that felt like a museum rather than a home. It was beautiful, but it lacked warmth. Mark wondered what it would be like to live here, to share a space with someone who had no intention of truly sharing anything. As they walked through the vast hallways, Eleanor gave him a brief tour of the house. "This is your home now," she said, her voice devoid of any real emotion. "You'll have your own room, your own space. But remember, this is a professional arrangement. We'll only interact when necessary. There's no need for anything beyond that." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He had agreed to this, but the reality of it felt harder to swallow now that he was here. He didn't belong in a place like this. He didn't belong with her. Later that evening, as they sat down to a quiet dinner, Eleanor's lawyer called to discuss the next steps. Mark found himself alone in the grand dining room, surrounded by the silence of the house. He couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. Despite being married, he was more alone than ever. He stared at his plate, unable to focus on the food in front of him. Eleanor seemed at ease, but Mark's stomach churned with uncertainty. What had he gotten himself into? As the night stretched on, Mark retreated to his new room, the weight of the day settling in his chest. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the opulent surroundings. It felt wrong. He wasn't sure what he expected when he agreed to this arrangement, but it certainly wasn't this. He was supposed to be living a new life, one that would save his family. But in that moment, Mark realized something. This wasn't a life he could simply walk into. This wasn't just about money. He had sold a piece of himself to get here, and it left him feeling empty. The next morning, as he wandered through the massive house, he came across a painting on the wall, a family portrait. He recognized the faces: Eleanor, her late husband, and their children. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this world. It wasn't just the money, the house, or the wealth that separated him from her. It was the life they had lived, the memories they had shared. He was intruding on a family, not joining one. As he stood there, staring at the portrait, Eleanor appeared behind him. "It's just a painting," she said, her voice colder than usual. "This house may have been a home once, but it's not anymore. And neither am I. This marriage, this contract, isn't about finding a home. It's about survival. We both know that." Her words stung, but they also made Mark realize that this wasn't a fairy tale. There would be no happily ever after here. Just a long, lonely road ahead. As the days went by, Mark settled into the rhythm of his new life. Eleanor kept her distance, as promised, and their interactions remained strictly professional. Every morning, he woke up in the grand, empty house, the silence of the place more deafening than the noise of the busy streets he had come from. He spent his days either in his room or walking around the estate, trying to avoid the uncomfortable truth that he was living in a house he didn't belong in, with a woman he didn't know, under circumstances he never imagined. But even in this cold, sterile environment, he couldn't shake the sense that something was slowly changing. It wasn't the house, or even the contract, but something about Eleanor herself. She was distant, yes, but there was a quiet strength in her that intrigued him. One evening, after a long day of paperwork and meetings, Mark found himself in the garden, taking in the vast expanse of the estate. He hadn't explored much of the grounds yet, but tonight felt different. The evening air was cool, and the sound of distant birdsong cut through the silence. He wandered deeper into the garden, past hedges and fountains, until he came across a small, secluded bench by a pond. It was peaceful here, away from the weight of the house and the contract that bound him to it. As he sat down, staring at the reflection of the stars in the water, he couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if he hadn't agreed to this marriage. Would he still be struggling to make ends meet? Or had he made the right choice? It was impossible to know for sure, but he couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. As Mark sat there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find Eleanor standing at the edge of the garden, watching him with a curious expression. "I didn't expect to find you out here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I thought you'd be inside, getting some rest." Mark stood up, unsure of what to say. "I just needed some air," he replied, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Eleanor walked over to him, her heels clicking on the stone path, and for the first time, Mark saw something different in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about her. For the first time since their arrangement began, Eleanor seemed human. She sat down beside him on the bench, the two of them silent for a moment. Mark could feel the tension between them, but there was also something unspoken, something that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. After a few minutes, Eleanor spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "I know this isn't what you expected," she said, "but I never wanted this either. It's just the only way I could secure my future." Mark turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "You've never really told me why," he said. "Why this arrangement? Why a marriage of convenience?" Eleanor sighed, her gaze focused on the water. "I've spent my whole life building an empire, Mark," she said, "but I never had anyone to share it with. I thought that if I had someone, anyone, by my side, it would be enough. But now, I'm starting to wonder if it's all worth it." Mark listened intently, trying to understand the woman he had married. She had always been so composed, so confident. But in that moment, she seemed more fragile than he ever imagined. "I didn't think it would be easy," she continued, "but I never expected it to feel so lonely. I thought I could handle it. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark didn't know what to say. He had his own fears, his own regrets, but hearing Eleanor's vulnerability made him realize just how complicated their situation really was. "Maybe it's not too late to change things," he said quietly, unsure of the words coming out of his mouth. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of answer. "Maybe," she replied, "but I don't know how to fix it." For a moment, there was a stillness between them, a silence that felt different from the usual tension. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but in that brief exchange, something had shifted. A spark of understanding, of something more, had ignited in the air. The next few days were filled with subtle changes. Eleanor began to open up more, sharing stories about her past, about the things that had shaped her into the woman she was. Mark listened, not just because he had to, but because he was starting to care. He was beginning to see Eleanor not as a business partner, not as a woman who had hired him for a contract, but as a person with hopes, fears, and dreams. He realized that, despite the coldness of their arrangement, they were both looking for something more. Neither of them had expected to find it in each other, but sometimes life had a way of surprising you. And so, Mark and Eleanor's strange, businesslike marriage continued, but it was beginning to feel less like a contract and more like a partnership. They still had their boundaries, still adhered to the rules of their arrangement, but something was shifting. They were no longer just two strangers sharing a house. They were becoming something more, something neither of them had ever anticipated. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. The once cold, businesslike partnership had begun to transform into something more meaningful, though neither of them would admit it. Their interactions, once strictly professional, were now laced with moments of understanding and quiet connection. Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, seemed to drop her guard around him. She still maintained the distance of their arrangement, but Mark could sense that she was no longer entirely closed off. She would share small details about her past, her childhood, the mistakes she had made. And, in return, Mark began to open up about his own life, his father's death, his struggles to make it through law school, and the weight of the debts that still hung over him. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had ever shared before. One evening, Eleanor asked Mark to join her at a gala she had been planning for weeks, a charity event meant to raise money for a cause she cared deeply about. Mark had never been to such an event before, and he wasn't sure what to expect. He had no idea how to act in a room full of high society guests, but Eleanor insisted that he accompany her. "You're my husband now," she said with a small, almost playful smile. "It's only fitting that you stand by my side." Mark wasn't sure what kind of role he was supposed to play, but he agreed, telling himself that this was just another part of the arrangement. On the night of the gala, Mark felt out of place. He stood beside Eleanor as she moved through the crowd, effortlessly charming everyone she spoke to. She was a natural in the spotlight, a commanding presence that demanded attention without saying a word. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a shadow. He wasn't used to being in the company of so many influential people. The glitz and glamour of the event were overwhelming, but he tried his best to blend in. Eleanor introduced him to several people, and he did his best to smile and make small talk. But as the night wore on, he began to notice something, a look in Eleanor's eyes when she caught his gaze. For the first time, he saw her not as the powerful CEO, but as a woman who was just as vulnerable as he was. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make him question everything. As the night progressed, the charity auction began. Eleanor took the stage to speak, her voice calm and confident as she addressed the crowd. Mark stood at the edge of the room, watching her with a sense of admiration. He had seen her in meetings, in the boardroom, always poised and in control. But tonight, there was something different about her. She spoke not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who truly cared about the cause. She was passionate about making a difference, and it was impossible not to be moved by her words. Mark couldn't help but feel a tug of something deep inside him. He had agreed to this marriage for the wrong reasons. He had thought it was all about money, but now he was beginning to see it differently. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman. She was someone who cared, who had dreams and fears just like anyone else. After her speech, Eleanor returned to Mark's side, and for the first time that night, he saw her smile in a way that wasn't part of her public persona. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and softened the lines of her face. "Thank you for coming with me," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Mark nodded, his heart beating a little faster than normal. There was something in the way she spoke, something that felt real. It made him realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had been playing a part in their marriage. Perhaps Eleanor, too, had been hiding behind a mask, afraid to show the world who she really was. Later that night, as they were leaving the gala, Eleanor took Mark's hand as they walked to the car. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make him pause. He hadn't expected her to be so human. For the first time, he realized that she wasn't just a powerful woman in a cold, grand house. She was someone who was capable of tenderness, of kindness. The thought caught him off guard. He had been so focused on the financial aspect of their arrangement, so determined to survive, that he had failed to see the person in front of him. But now, as they stood in the quiet of the night, Mark began to wonder if he was starting to feel something more than just obligation toward Eleanor. Could it be that, in the process of trying to save his family, he had started to save himself? The drive back to the estate was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Eleanor seemed lost in thought, her gaze focused on the road ahead. Mark couldn't help but steal glances at her, wondering what was going through her mind. Was she feeling the same shift he was? Did she, too, feel the growing connection between them? Or was he just imagining it? He wasn't sure, but for the first time since their marriage began, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a business deal after all. Maybe there was something real between them, a chance for something more than either of them had expected. The following days after the gala felt different. Mark found himself seeing Eleanor in a new light. She was still the powerful CEO he had married, the woman who had offered him a way out of his financial troubles. But now, he could no longer ignore the small moments of kindness that had begun to appear in their interactions. It wasn't just the way she smiled at him sometimes, or the way she started sharing more personal stories about her past. It was the way she cared, in subtle ways, asking about his day, remembering the small things he mentioned, and giving him space when he needed it. These weren't the actions of a cold, calculated businesswoman. They were the actions of someone who was, perhaps, starting to feel something for him. It was late one evening when everything changed. Mark was sitting in the living room, working through some legal documents. Eleanor had been out for most of the day, handling business matters. The estate was quiet, too quiet, and Mark found himself wishing for the noise of the city again. As he leaned back in his chair, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw Eleanor standing in the doorway. She was dressed casually, her usual polished appearance replaced with a softness that was unfamiliar. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mark," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "I think we need to talk." Her words, simple as they were, made Mark's heart race. He set the papers aside, his mind immediately jumping to all the things they had left unsaid. Was this the moment when the cracks in their arrangement would show? Was she finally going to tell him that this had been nothing more than a business transaction all along? He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "What is it?" he asked, his voice betraying the nervousness he was feeling. Eleanor stepped into the room, closing the door behind her, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then she spoke again, her words hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about this, about us," she began. "I know this was supposed to be just a contract, just an arrangement. But I don't think I can keep pretending that it's only that. I'm not good at this feeling thing." She paused, searching for the right words. "But I feel something, Mark. Something I didn't expect. I think I've been hiding behind this mask for so long, I forgot what it was like to let someone in. And now, I don't know what to do about it." Mark stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. Not from Eleanor, not from the woman who had always kept her emotions in check. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had spent so much time thinking about his own problems, about his family, that he had never allowed himself to consider the possibility that Eleanor might be struggling with her own fears and uncertainties. He took a step forward, his voice low as he finally spoke. "Eleanor, he began, but she cut him off gently. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I've been so focused on making sure everything looks perfect, on keeping everything under control, that I never gave myself the chance to feel anything. And I know you didn't agree to this for any of the right reasons. You agreed to help your family, and I can't pretend that this wasn't a business deal. But I can't ignore what's happening between us. And I'm scared, Mark. I'm scared that I'm starting to want more than what we agreed on." Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't sure what to say next. He had spent so long trying to stay distant, trying to keep his emotions in check. But hearing her say these things, he realized just how much he had been holding back too. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. He took another step toward her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I never expected any of this, Eleanor. When I agreed to this marriage, I thought it was just a way out, a way to solve my problems. But I've been living in this house with you, and I'm starting to see you differently. I don't know what this means or where it's going, but I know I don't want to hide from it anymore." Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. It was a quiet moment, but it felt like the weight of everything between them was suddenly lighter. She reached out, her hand trembling just slightly as she touched his arm. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant everything. For the first time since their marriage had begun, there was no mask, no contract, just two people standing in front of each other, acknowledging the connection that had formed between them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real. And for the first time, both of them were willing to face whatever came next together. As the night wore on, Mark and Eleanor found themselves talking about everything, about their fears, their dreams, their pasts. They shared things they had never expected to share, and as the evening drew to a close, they realized that their relationship had shifted. No longer just a marriage of convenience, it had become something deeper, something more fragile but real. For the first time, they both believed that they might have found something more than just a way out of their individual problems. They might have found the beginning of something neither of them had ever expected. The days following their honest conversation felt like a turning point in Mark and Eleanor's marriage. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but there was something different in the air between them. They both knew it, even though neither of them spoke about it directly. There was a newfound understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that something real had developed, even if they were still unsure of what that meant. Eleanor, for the first time, let her guard down fully around Mark. She didn't act as if she was the powerful CEO that she was accustomed to being. Instead, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, showing him a side of herself that Mark hadn't seen before. As for Mark, he couldn't ignore the way he had started to feel about Eleanor. The more he learned about her, the struggles she had faced, the walls she had built around herself, the more he admired her. But it wasn't just admiration. There was something deeper, something more than the connection they had formed out of necessity. Mark had never thought he would fall for someone like her. She had been a mystery at first, cold, distant, calculating, but now he realized how much he had been wrong. Eleanor had layers, a past, and a heart that was still capable of love, even if she had hidden it for so long. One evening, after another long day of work, Eleanor invited Mark to a dinner she had arranged at their estate. It wasn't a formal gathering, just the two of them. As they sat down at the dining table, Eleanor poured wine into their glasses, her movements graceful, almost like a dance. The room was softly lit, the flickering candlelight casting gentle shadows on their faces. The tension between them had all but disappeared, replaced by a comfortable silence. They had stopped pretending. "Mark," Eleanor began, her voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking about the future. I know we never agreed on what this marriage would become, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I can't help but wonder, could this be more than just a contract? Could we find something real here, despite everything?" Her words caught him off guard. She had always been so controlled, so in charge of everything. And yet here she was, asking him to consider something that neither of them had expected. Mark looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about the contract anymore. It wasn't about solving his financial problems, and it wasn't about doing what was best for his family. It was about them, and the possibility of a life together that neither of them had planned. He had never imagined that this could be more than a deal, but now, sitting across from Eleanor, he could feel it. Something real was starting to grow between them. "I've never been one to believe in fate or destiny," Mark said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "But I think I'm starting to understand what you mean. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that right now, being with you, it feels different. It feels like more than just a business arrangement." Eleanor's eyes softened as she listened to him. It wasn't often that she let her emotions show, but Mark could see it now, the uncertainty in her eyes, the vulnerability that she had kept hidden for so long. "I think I've been running from the truth," Eleanor admitted, looking down at her glass of wine before meeting his gaze. "I told myself that I could control everything, that I didn't need anyone. But you've shown me that maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been too focused on building this empire and not enough on the people who matter." She paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding, Mark. Maybe it's time to let myself care again. To let us care." Mark reached across the table and took her hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that simple touch, they both understood that they were no longer playing a part in a contract. This wasn't about obligations or survival anymore. It was about the possibility of something real. And though the future was still uncertain, they both knew that they were willing to take that step together. Over the next few weeks, their bond continued to deepen. They began to spend more time together outside of the confines of their home. They went for walks in the garden, shared dinners at local restaurants, and talked about everything, from their past to their dreams for the future. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, piece by piece. Mark wasn't sure when it had happened, but one day, he realized that he no longer saw Eleanor just as the woman who had offered him a way out of his struggles. He saw her as someone he wanted to build a life with. It wasn't perfect. Their marriage was still unconventional, still rooted in a contract that they hadn't fully rewritten. But what had started as an arrangement between two strangers was now something much more complex, and, in many ways, much more meaningful. Eleanor had come to trust him in ways she never thought possible, and Mark had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was falling in love with her. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their new reality. But this time, there was no pretending. No more masks. They were two people trying to figure out what their future held, but for the first time, they were willing to face it together. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship began to feel less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. They still had their boundaries, their unspoken rules, but there was something undeniably different in the air between them. Their time together had become less about the contract and more about understanding one another. Mark no longer felt like a stranger in Eleanor's world. He had become a part of it, and as the days went by, it seemed as though the walls they had built up around themselves were slowly crumbling. Eleanor, too, was beginning to soften. She still maintained her position as the powerful CEO, but there were moments when she let her guard down and allowed herself to experience the things she had kept hidden for so long: love, vulnerability, and trust. One evening, Mark and Eleanor were sitting in the garden, enjoying a quiet dinner under the stars. It had become a ritual for them, one that allowed them to escape the demands of their daily lives. They had been discussing something trivial, the kind of light-hearted conversation that had become more common between them, when Eleanor suddenly fell silent. Mark glanced at her, noticing the change in her demeanor. She seemed distant, lost in thought. "What is it?" Mark asked, his voice gentle. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what we've become, what we're building together. I know we never agreed on this, and I know I was the one who asked for this contract. But lately, I've been wondering if it's time to stop pretending, to stop hiding behind the deal and start facing what's real." She paused, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "I can't help but feel like we've come so far. And maybe, just maybe, this could be more than just a business arrangement. Maybe it could be something else." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for a response. Mark felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Eleanor had been hesitant to speak openly about her feelings for so long, and now here she was, asking for something more. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. He had never imagined that their marriage, which had started as a solution to his financial problems, could turn into something more. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much had changed. "I never expected this," Mark said, his voice low but steady. "When I agreed to this marriage, I thought it was just a way to get out of debt, to help my family. But now I can't imagine my life without you in it. This started as a contract, but it's become something else, something real. And I'm starting to believe that we could have more than just a partnership. We could have a future together." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I want to see where this goes, Eleanor. I want to stop pretending and start building something real with you, if you'll have me." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Mark saw a flicker of hope in her expression. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she took his. The gesture was simple, but it was everything. In that moment, neither of them needed to say anything more. They both knew that they had crossed a line they had never expected to cross, and they were both ready to see what lay on the other side. As they sat there, their hands intertwined under the soft glow of the candles, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a life he could now see for himself. And as for Eleanor, she had found someone who could see beyond her wealth and power, someone who could love her for who she truly was. They didn't need to have everything figured out, they just needed to take the next step together. The evening ended with the two of them walking back to the house, side by side, no longer just two people bound by a contract, but two people beginning to explore the possibility of a real future together. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, they were willing to find them together. As the weeks went by, Mark and Eleanor found themselves falling into a routine that felt more and more like a genuine partnership. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They spent more time together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They shared meals, went for walks in the garden, and started to have conversations that went beyond the surface. They began to talk about their hopes for the future, their fears, and everything in between. The walls that had once separated them were slowly coming down, and they were starting to build something that felt more like a real marriage. One evening, Eleanor suggested they attend a charity event together. Mark had gotten used to the formal gatherings and was no longer the shy, out-of-place man he once was. Eleanor had been nothing but supportive, and he felt more confident in his place by her side. As they arrived at the event, Eleanor's usual poise and grace were on full display. But Mark noticed something different. There was a softness to her, something he hadn't seen before. She wasn't just the CEO, the powerful woman who ran everything with a sharp mind and steady hand. She was someone who cared, who wanted to make a difference. They spent the evening talking to people, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. As the night went on, Eleanor took the stage to speak about the charity they were supporting. Mark watched her from the crowd, proud of how far she had come. She spoke with passion, not as a businesswoman, but as someone who truly believed in the cause. Mark had always admired her strength, but in that moment, he realized that she had more to offer than just her intellect. She had heart, and that was something he hadn't fully recognized before. When she returned to his side, she smiled at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you for being here," she said. Mark nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," he replied, his voice sincere. As the night drew to a close, Mark found himself looking at Eleanor with a sense of admiration and something deeper. She had become more than just a partner in a marriage of convenience. She had become someone he truly cared for. In the weeks that followed, their relationship continued to evolve. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were learning to navigate life together, hand in hand. And while there were still challenges to face, they faced them together, each step bringing them closer to the future they were beginning to imagine. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind the roles they had played. They were building something real, something that was no longer just about survival, but about love, trust, and the possibility of a future together. One day, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the garden, Eleanor turned to Mark, her expression thoughtful. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I never imagined that this would be how I'd find what I've been looking for. I thought I had everything figured out, that I didn't need anyone. But you've shown me that I was wrong. I don't just need a companion. I need you." Mark's heart swelled as he looked at her, the woman who had once been a stranger, and now was someone he couldn't imagine his life without. "Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I feel the same way. I never expected this to be the way I'd find myself either. But now I can't picture my life without you in it." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. The connection between them was undeniable, stronger than anything either of them had expected. In that quiet moment, they both knew that they had crossed a line. They had gone from a marriage of convenience to something much more, and neither of them had any intention of turning back. Mark and Eleanor still had their doubts, still had a lot of unknowns ahead of them. But for the first time, they both believed that what they had could withstand whatever challenges came their way. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building a life, a real life, together. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's marriage continued to grow in ways neither of them had anticipated. What started as an arrangement between two strangers had blossomed into something that felt more like a partnership than a contract. They had learned to trust each other, to share their hopes and fears, and to face the challenges of life together. Their love had not been instant, but it had been built on mutual respect, understanding, and shared experiences. They no longer saw each other as mere business partners, but as two people who had found something real in the most unexpected of places. One morning, as Mark was sipping his coffee in the kitchen, he looked out the window at the garden, where Eleanor was sitting with a sketchbook in her lap, lost in her thoughts. He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He had never imagined that he would find peace in a life like this. But here he was, standing next to the woman he had once seen only as a solution to his financial struggles, now someone he couldn't imagine his life without. When he joined her outside, Eleanor looked up and smiled, her eyes soft and knowing. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice calm but full of emotion, "about how much has changed between us, and about how much I've changed since you came into my life." Mark sat down beside her, his heart swelling with affection. "I've changed too," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd find something real in all of this. But I have, and I'm glad I took that chance." Eleanor's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, a peaceful silence that spoke volumes. Later that day, as they walked through the halls of their home, Eleanor turned to him, her expression serious yet tender. "Mark, I don't think I ever truly believed in second chances, but you've shown me that it's never too late to find something real. You've shown me that I can still love, that I can still let someone in." She paused, taking his hand in hers. "I think, for the first time, I'm ready to truly commit to this. To us. No more pretending, no more contracts. Just us." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. Mark's chest tightened as he looked at her, his own emotions threatening to overflow. Eleanor, he began, his voice full of emotion, I'm ready too. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They stood there for a moment, their hands still intertwined, and both of them knew that this was it. The beginning of something new, something real. There was no more contract, no more arrangements. They had found something deeper in each other, a love that had grown out of mutual understanding and respect. That night, as they lay in bed together, Mark felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He was living a life filled with love, trust, and the possibility of a future they had never imagined. And as Eleanor's head rested on his chest, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. Together, they had created something that was real, something that couldn't be broken by a contract or by the past. The next day, as they stood in the garden, hand in hand, Mark looked at Eleanor and smiled. This is our second chance, he said, his voice full of hope. And I'm not letting it go. Eleanor smiled back, a tear slipping down her cheek. Neither am I, she whispered. Together, they turned to face the future, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, no longer bound by a contract, but by something far more powerful.